All right, we can get started. Hello, everyone. How are you doing?
Good.
Great. All right. Sorry about my voice. I kind of caught a cold because the weather here is not what I expected. My name is Corina, for those of you who don't already know me since yesterday or from yesterday. I am a person with slides. So I've been a tester for like over 12 years already. I've worked on all kinds of projects at different companies. I worked on backend, frontend, API, whatever you can imagine. I did load testing. I've worked in a lot of teams with a lot of specifics and with a lot of problems. I mean, let's not call them problems. Like we had all kinds of issues where we had to use our troubleshooting skills to find out, what is happening in the system. And based on some true stories, I decided to give a talk about troubleshooting and how we can help in this process so that it's not only the developers who are doing this. And I will also give you some tips that I have, from my personal experience, have helped me with trying to troubleshoot an issue. And if you want to know more about me, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter, I have a blog, I have a series of comics, who somebody in this room likes, by the way, thank you. I have GitHub, I have whatever, and I'm very open to questions and feedback after the talk, so if you want to get in touch, don't hesitate to do so. What the fudge? So what are we going to talk about today? There might be situations when something is happening in our system, a very nasty bug or a very interesting behavior can be observed. Something is not working properly and somebody needs to investigate it. This issue is happening there, but the root cause is not very obvious. We must find out why that issue is happening in our product, right? So what can we do about it? So the first thing that we need to do is to reproduce that issue, right? If we see something only once, it's going to be a bit difficult to actually have someone to fix that problem. So the first thing we need to focus on is reproducing that issue that we have encountered. Sometimes we might say that the issue is random, right? So we saw it once, we cannot reproduce it. Now, we might say that this is random. And in certain cases, it might be random, but mostly it's not. Why? Because when somebody accesses our systems, they're going to, they're doing something on the front end, let's say, right? So somebody comes to our web page and they're doing something. In the background, certain lines of code are getting executed every time somebody does that same action, right? So every time somebody will do something, the same set of code should be executed. So normally, when somebody's doing the same thing over and over again on the same version of the application, it shouldn't be random that we see an issue because the same code gets run in the background, right? If we do see that the issue is random, then we are going to look at certain things, like why do we think is random and what can cause this randomness. But normally, there should be a specific path to reproduce each issue. So the first thing to do is to consistently reproduce the issue at least, let's say, 3 times. Why? Because then we have a certainty that these steps that we're doing right now are those that are definitely causing our problem. This is one of the true stories I was talking about earlier. So we had a bug in a system. It was there for 2 years. It was categorized, and it also had in the description the word random. Nobody fixed it for 2 years. Nobody was even looking at it. When we were doing grooming sessions, we would just, we just looked at it. We looked at the title and we just said, oh, random, we'll just put it into another sprint. There was a discussion at one point. We had a backlog grooming where we said, okay, let's at least take a look at what the description is in the bug description. And it said, this issue happens when you're typing this, and it happens on an environment, but it doesn't happen on another environment. We currently reproduced it right there on one environment. So we managed to reproduce the bug in one environment, but we couldn't reproduce in another one. We were preparing for a release, so we had just encountered this issue. And somebody said, oh, it must be something with the application. We should reinstall the app. It should work fine because on this other environment, it works fine. Reinstalling the application would have taken about 3 days, so we would have lost 3 crucial days for testing our release. So I started asking a lot of questions like, how do you reproduce it? Can you show me what kind of data you're using, and so on and so on. And as the person next to me was trying to reproduce the issue, I realized that although the person said, I'm using the exact same data on both environments, there was a difference. So on the environment, when they reproduced the issue, they were typing specific characters, but on the other one, they weren't. They weren't using the exact type of data to reproduce the issue on both environments. And that was the issue. The data that they were feeding into an environment was causing the bug. Once they inputted the same data in the other environment, they could reproduce the issue there too. So the whole thing was that it wasn't random at all. There was a clear way to reproduce the problem. There was a clear set of data that was causing the problem. The fix probably took, maybe the actual fix, like without pulling the code and doing the code reviews and so on, was probably somewhere about 10, 20 minutes. So testing was about, again, 10 minutes just to make sure, on our browsers and so on. So basically, a bug that was in the system for 2 years was fixed in maybe, let's say, 30 minutes in total. And we actually managed to get that out of the way. The conclusion I drew from here was that we always need to make sure we don't categorize something as random, and we try to reproduce it exactly the way we initially reproduced it. So sometimes we encounter such a behavior when we are doing something else, right? Maybe we are trying to test a very large scenario, and we have like 100 steps that we need to do, and somewhere along the way we encounter a bug. We need to retrace our steps, and it's not always easy because sometimes when we're really focused on getting to that 100th step, we kind of forget what we were doing before, or we're doing like mechanic work, we're just typing, and we're not paying very much attention. But once we encounter a bug, if it's a crucial bug, if it's something that we think we really must investigate, we should spend effort and time to try to reproduce that and to try to figure out how we actually got to that particular bug. 3 times, I said 3 times, just because if we reproduce it once, it might be an accident, we might have done something, we might not realize exactly what we did. 3 times makes sure we know exactly which is the path and which is the set of data that we need in order to reproduce the issue. If we couldn't reproduce the issue, the first question for me would be, did you have your coffee today? If you did, and you're exactly sure that you used the exact same type of data, the exact same steps as you did initially when you reproduced the issue, you might encounter one of the following. Let's say you have a system where you are running your application from several machines, right? You have several servers where your application is deployed, and you have a load balancer in front. And so when you're trying to work with your application, you're actually working with a load balancer. And the load balancer will send your requests randomly to different machines, trying to balance the load there. Sometimes when you're encountering this issue randomly, it might be that the request that you have made to the system actually goes to one of the machines that is broken. And when you try it again, the request will not go to the same machine, okay? So if you try it multiple times, then you can actually figure out that, okay, we have a machine that is down, or where the application wasn't installed properly, or where something happened, right? So then, in this case, the issue is not random, really. The only thing that was random is the fact that you hit one machine or the other one. But in fact, you do have a problem there with one machine. And if you take that out of the load balancer and you would, perform the same steps again, then you would not encounter the issue anymore. So it wouldn't be random, right? Another issue might be that when you tried to do something, there was a communication error, like maybe the network was temporarily down, or it was very slow right at the time when you were trying to do something. Or maybe there was some hardware issue right at the time, like hardware gets stuck from time to time, so maybe you just encountered that moment when the hardware was stuck. Maybe there was like a temporary database lock, something like that. In case the behavior that you observe, the bug, is critical, or is something that is really causing maybe loss of data or really bad user experience, you should spend time trying to figure out what the issue was, even if it's not going to be very easy. Like even if you have to debug all kinds of things until you actually get to these, it's really worth spending that time rather than this issue occurring again in production and having your customers experience it. Because if it happened to you once and it led to some kind of catastrophic behavior, who's going to say that it doesn't happen in production? So it's better to be prepared for something like that. So let's say that you have managed to reproduce the issue. You know exactly what are the steps in order to get to that annoying behavior. The first thing we need to ask ourselves is this a new issue or was it observed before? In my experience, many times the issue might have happened before. So we might have had this issue like a build ago or last week or 2 days ago, okay? We will go through these two categories, let's say when the issue is new and when we have seen it before. If we saw the issue before, we need to start asking, what was the fix? Because if we didn't observe it for like, let's say a week, something happened so that it didn't appear in the system anymore. Somebody fixed something, somebody maybe was working on a new feature and they put new code into the, let's say, master branch, and probably somebody else wasn't aware of the purpose of that code and they overwrote it or they removed it or they did something like that without communicating to the person who made those changes. Like this can happen a lot. When people work on different branches, developers I mean in this case, they might not communicate with each other. So the code that gets written by one person is not explained to someone else and they can just overwrite the code, or they can just, when they're trying to merge their code, they're just looking at some code there and they're like, why is this like that? I don't think it's right. Let me put it back the way it was, right? So this can happen. So in this case, if you see such a recurring issue, it's very important to communicate with the people involved. So you or whoever is looking at the issue can talk to the people who did all of these commits just so that everybody is on the same page as to why a certain commit was pushed into the repository or why somebody else changed it, so that everybody is on the same page and that this doesn't happen again in the future, right? What if the issue was seen before, but it wasn't actually an issue that was fixed? We might already have some information because maybe somebody already started investigating it. So we might not need to do our investigation from scratch because we already have some information. That's good. So this will save us some time. At the same time, we need to make sure that whoever did the investigation did it properly. I'm not saying that people do a crappy job. It's just that sometimes maybe you're not on the right track when you're investigating something. People might just drop an investigation, maybe they won't document anywhere what they did, which is the worst thing that can happen. Then you just need to talk to the people who did the initial research so that you're on the same page. And try not to be, let's say, persuaded by their beliefs. So if somebody is investigating something, try to double check that whatever they found is correct. Many times people make assumptions. Like I've seen this happen a lot of times. Like you will ask somebody, why is this not working? And they're gonna say, it's because this happened. But they will not check that that is the case. They will just assume that this is why this happened. So it's better for us, if we are starting an investigation, to have all of the information and to gather it ourselves so that we know that we are looking at the correct information. If the issue is a newly discovered one, so it was never seen before and nobody investigated it, then we have a lot of work to do. So we need to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what happened there. Let's say we have an issue that appears in one environment and it doesn't appear in another environment. When this happens, I usually look at 5 things. I'm looking at my own software and I'm looking at the build version for my own software. Then I'm looking at the configurations for my software, because sometimes you have, you enable things or you disable things or you set certain properties in a configuration file. And these might not be the same on different environments. When you're doing the deployment, maybe you forgot to set a certain flag to a value or something like that. I also look at dependencies. So normally the software I work on has dependencies because every software might have a dependency to another library or to another service. We might communicate with other services when we offer our own services. So we are also looking at the versions of the dependency And we are also looking at the configuration of the dependency because just like our system, they also have their own configuration. Last but not least, and this is not the full list, but these are the first 5 things I would look at, we have the hardware configuration because we might have, like our test environments, they're not production-like, so we don't have the same setup as in production, and we might not even have the same setup across all of the test environments. So if we're looking at all of these 5 things, so software version, software configuration, dependency version, dependency configuration, and hardware, we might get into the following situation. So let's say that the only thing different between an environment where everything works fine and an environment where we reproduce the issue is the build number of our own software. So let's say that we encountered the bug on the latest code that we pushed, so on our latest build. What can we do then? Well, we can see what is the build number deployed on a machine where everything works fine, and we can just trace back all of the commits that were made from the current build back to that build which was stable. And based on that, we can identify what code was committed and what is the code that might lead to our unexpected behavior. Even more, if you really want to make sure, you could just deploy the same build on the broken machine, and that would kind of confirm that it's in the build. So then you would be 100% that it was the build that was faulty. The next thing that we can take a look at, if the build number is the same and everything else is the same except for the configuration, then it's probably the configuration that has a problem. You could just change the configuration on the new machine where you deployed the latest code to the other configuration, and then this will probably lead to everything working fine. However, if your latest configuration is the one that you need, then you need to look at that and try to understand what happened and why that is causing a problem. Sometimes it might happen that when new code is deployed, they forget to change something in the configuration, they forget to add a parameter in the configuration, they forget to deploy other things related to the configuration, like maybe they forgot to deploy a new column in a table and something like that. So when it comes to configurations, it's a bit easier to figure out what happened and to change it, because you don't need to do a major release and stuff like that. You would just need to change a file and maybe restart the machine or something like that. When it comes to dependencies, well, that's a bit trickier. What can a dependency be? It's either a library that you're using in your service or it's a different service. So let's talk about libraries. So let's say that your project has some dependencies, like maybe you need Spring for something, maybe you need, I don't know, some API, some JSON libraries, whatever you need, right? These libraries constantly get updated. Sometimes the latest deployment that they do, or the latest version of their library, is kind of breaking something for you. So they're releasing something, but they don't really know how everybody will use that library. So they are not really aware of what impact a change might apply to your own code. So when you're in this situation that you have updated a dependency to a version that is not working properly for you, the first thing you could do is just revert to an older version of the dependency. If you really need the new version, then you could just get in touch with whoever is developing that library and let them know of your issue. Kindly ask them to release a version where they can fix that for you, okay? For example, in my testing, so this is not troubleshooting, but I also had something similar with a version from Appium. I was running my tests and I was doing some updates and I got the latest version of Appium, and I realized that my tests started failing randomly. I also had some Selenium tests there and all kinds of things, but my tests started failing with some very strange Selenium error, and I didn't understand where that was coming from. So as I was looking at the repository of Appium, I realized that they had created a new version where they updated the Selenium dependency to the latest alpha version of Selenium. So alpha versions are not production-ready versions; they are just for testing purposes. So I kind of asked on Twitter like why this happened, and the people who were working on the Appium library said, "Oh, sorry, this was a mistake. We shouldn't have done that. We're going to release a new version. we're putting back the old version. And once they did that, I updated the dependency and it was all fine. So this was that kind of a communication that we need with our dependencies. They were aware of the issue and they fixed it so that we can continue running our tests. So this is similar to any other library you might use in your project or in your code. What if your dependency is not a library but a service? So maybe like in a large company, usually you have multiple services that interact, right? So you're consuming code written by other people, or you're the one who is providing code to other people. Sometimes in this situation, things might break because each service has their own backlog and they're working on their own stuff. Sometimes when they implement something, they might not tell everyone, hey, look, we've changed this or we've done this. They might just deploy their code into the test environment. And if you're running your tests in the same environment, you have your software in the same environment as them, that might break something in your own code. So in this case, it's even easier because if you're within the same company, you are within reach. So you can more easily talk to the people who are working on that dependency and kindly ask them, can you tell me why this has happened? Can you tell me why you've made this change? Should we do something on our end? Could you temporarily revert to an older version? Can you fix it? Because for us, it's not working. So it's all about communicating with whoever is your dependency there. This is really, really easy. And I've seen that people are very open to helping you out. Many times, if you are the consumer of another service and something like this happens, like the third party, let's say, is breaking your own code, people would just, like our team would just stay at their office and they would just, oh, this is not working, this team is doing a crappy job and so on. Instead of just reaching out to them and, talking to them about why this happened. Genuinely, it might be that they were not aware of how you're using their service and how their changes might impact your own code. So communication is very important. And it's the same thing with dependency configuration. So in case the dependency version was one that needs to be updated, that's a bit tricky because that implies, for them to make a new release, for them to do regression testing, and that takes a lot of time. When it comes to the dependency configuration, it's much easier. So there you can just change a file, restart or redeploy. So it could take like maybe an hour, let's say. So this would be like a very happy scenario where you just need to update the configurations of either your or their service. When it comes to the hardware configuration, well, once you have gone through the first four items, if you still have the issue on one machine and not on the other one, then you start looking at other more non-software related things like hardware, right? Maybe your machine where you encounter an issue has not that much power as the other machine, like you have too few RAMs, too few low storing space and so on. So once you get to the hardware, it's a bit trickier because there you can check for a lot of things, but you can start with just looking at the machine where you have deployed your code and maybe just figure out, like, it might be something really easy. Or if it's not that, then you will have to go back to things, like I said, like database, network, and so on and so on. Usually, these are when you're looking at these, you might encounter the issue there. So in my experience, the first four were usually the ones that were causing issues. And also, when we're talking about dependencies, I know that many people are mocking their dependencies. So either they're mocking test data or they're mocking the response that the services, that the external dependencies are returning to your service. When you're using mocks and somebody is updating their own code and you're not aware of that, you might not catch such situations. You might not catch these issues because you are not working with the real data and the real service that they're working on. And you might end up getting into staging like a week before production or even into production with the latest code, and you would realize only there that the integration is not working because you never tried their own data and their own new code. So for me, it's very important not to work with mock data, but with the real services. Okay. What to do when you encounter the bug? Logs are your best friend. So it's not only the developer's task to take a look at the logs. You can be the one who does that too. Think about it as you're trying to solve a puzzle, right? There is a puzzle and you need to gather all the pieces, put them together in order to find out what has happened. Logs can tell you a lot of things. Logs can tell you, what kind of data was passed through the system, what kind of exception was thrown, and usually exceptions will also lead you to a class name or to some more information that you can trace back to commits. When you're looking at the logs, you don't need to know you don't need to be an expert in coding, right? You don't need to be able to write the most sophisticated Java code, for example. You just need some pointers to figure out how to look at the logs and how to look at exceptions and how to figure out, let's say what part of the software a certain exception belongs to. For example, if you know that yesterday a colleague of yours was working on a specific piece because you've discussed this in the stand-up, when you're looking at the logs, you might see an exception that kind of in your memory triggers the discussion you had at the stand-up, and you might think, oh, this looks like something that this colleague was working on yesterday. So you can just reach out to them and tell them, this is something I noticed. Is this the code you were working on? And chances are that that's the case. And when you do this, you talk to them, they can fix the problem quite easily. Sometimes you don't have the logs. That's bad. Whenever developers are working on new, like maybe you're working on the API and you're implementing new methods, all of those need to have proper logs. So you need to be able to figure out what happened in your system once you go live, right? Many teams don't have logs as part of their definition of done, but for me, it's very important that that exists. So whenever you're building a new feature that has also a backend, usually the backend is going to throw errors, but also it's very important for you to have the logs in place. You need to have as much information as you can without, putting confidential information there or putting information that is not needed, right? You need to log, but don't log too much and don't log too little, if you understand what I mean. So you don't need to log every single thing that happens because then you won't be able to read the logs. And you also need to store information in the logs in such a way that is easy to gather. So I don't want to have to look at 5 logs when I'm checking for something. I should have an error log, and that's where I'm going to look for all the errors that occur. So that's where I'm going to see all of the exceptions. So having this as part of the definition of done for your story will enable you to figure out what is happening when an unexpected behavior occurs. What happens when you have issues in the browser? So let's say you're trying to click on something and it doesn't happen, or you need to clear the cache for everything to work. What tools can you use in order to figure out what is happening in the browser? The most common thing you can use, and the one that's free and it's by default in your browsers, is the so-called DevTools, formerly Firebug and similar for all the browsers. So Firebug can show you in the console tab all kinds of errors that come, for example, from JavaScript. You can see the network tab, which is very important to understand the flow of the data in your system. So let's say that you clicked on something and there was a redirect and some parameters were passed and some resources weren't available, or some endpoint threw an HTTP 500 error. All of this information you can see in the network tab. So it's a very useful tool for you to find out where the data is going and what exactly is blocking things. Like maybe you have a third-party integration, like they're for commercial reasons, for advertising reasons, that might try to make a call from your app or to your app, and that might be blocking everything else. So you can see this in the network tab, and you can just say, okay, this is not working, we should remove this, or we need to address these things. You can also see whether all of the resources have loaded. Sometimes you need to load CSS files or JS files, and for some reason they get stuck or they take too much to load. You can see this there, and then you can find a solution to this problem. Okay, it's very important to speak out. So whenever somebody is doing debugging or troubleshooting, it's very important for them to share the information with everybody else. I don't think people realize how important this is. So whenever you're discussing with other people, you can get ideas from them, whether they will put you on the right track or whether they will tell you not to continue on the track you're on. Any idea is very useful for your process. For example, I had a situation a few weeks ago when we encountered a bug. It was something that we didn't know where it was from, and I remember that somebody who was on holiday was working on something that had similar words in the description. Like we were talking about something, something, something buzzword, and then I remembered that this colleague was working on something, something buzzword. And I asked, we were in a group, and I asked, could this be related to what this person on holiday was doing? And I saw a developer who was doing what is she talking about? She doesn't know what she's talking about. But then I saw the other developer thinking, maybe that's where that issue was coming from. So no idea is stupid when you're trying to figure out the issue. It's just an idea. You can follow it through, see if it leads you somewhere. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But you don't need to have this attitude of just, why is this person talking? Any ideas are very useful, and information is useful. So communication in a team when you're debugging something is crucial. And if somebody doesn't like it, well, that's their problem. All right. So when you've tried something, so you're trying to find the root cause of something, and you've spent days and you haven't reached a conclusion, and it seems like the path that you're taking is not going to lead you where you're supposed to go. You're not going to find a solution on that path. It's not a problem to go back and try something else. Even if you've wasted 3 days, you didn't really waste those days. You have gathered information. You know that what you have tried is not the solution, so you can now, in the future, not try the same thing again. You can try something else. It's not at all bad, and you don't have to just continue on that path, because I've seen developers get frustrated trying to figure out something, and they're just stuck there, and they just won't accept any other ideas and any other path to try. That's wrong, because you won't ever find the root cause if you're not on the right path, right? So you can just go back, clear your mind, try to clear your mind after you've done a lot of debugging. Clearing your mind is going to help you a lot. For example, what helps me is just going out and not thinking about IT for 5 minutes. Like if I don't think about the software, I will eventually think about it without wanting it, and then I will have new ideas and fresh ideas, okay? So it's good to take a break sometimes for you to have, a clear vision of how to proceed next with this troubleshooting. And I am done with my talk.